Okay, what is the Hebrew Bible? What is the Old Testament? Well, first of all, those two phrases, Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, where do they come from? Old Testament really is the result of Jeremiah's prophecy, where Jeremiah talks about the days will come when I will make a new covenant. And of course, Brit is the Hebrew for that. Brit Chadashah is the phrase which becomes diatheke in the Greek, in the Septuagint. The translation for diatheke in Latin is testamentum, and so testament really is the Latin from the Greek, from the Hebrew, meaning covenant. So the Old Covenant. And so, of course, loosely speaking, these 39 books represent God's covenant with the Israelites. Hebrew Bible became popular among Protestants, particularly in the modern period, where it became a way of not implying that the Old Testament has somehow been replaced or superseded or given secondary importance to the New Testament. And so Hebrew Bible is often used by those who don't wish to offend those who don't like the New Covenant in a way, or the New Testament. So anywho, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, what is it? Well, as I said a second ago, you have 39 books in the Protestant Old Testament. And so we'll sort of start off by looking at the Protestant canon, which of course is very similar to the Jewish canon for the Jewish Bible, or for what we would call the Old Testament. 39 books. The language of these books, as you probably know, is Hebrew and Aramaic. Most of Daniel is written in Aramaic. Also, the book of Ezra is written in Aramaic. So not a whole lot. You can, if you're into languages and vocabulary, you can pretty much learn all of the Aramaic vocabulary in the Old Testament without too much trouble. The rest of the books are written in Hebrew. Of course, that's, if you're into vocabulary, that's a lot of words. I think you're looking at 10,000 or so. Okay, what's in the storyline of the Old Testament? Of course, it goes from creation through the period of exile for the Israelites, and so it's Israelite history by and large, starting with creation, going through all of the different periods that were discussed in a previous lecture, through to the exilic period and the return from exile. When was this written? We're looking at the 15th century through to the Persian period, which is an enormous period of time. I mean, you're looking at about 1,000 years, right? So Cyrus the Great allowed people to return from exile in the middle of the 6th century. So, 539 is the date. And so if Moses wrote the Pentateuch in the middle of the 15th century, I mean, that's 900 years. And of course, so basically the Old Testament was written over a period of about 1,000 years, which is an enormous period of time. Even for more liberal scholars who feel that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, they date the writing of the Pentateuch to a later time period, but they also date the closing of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, at a later time too. So anyway you look at it, you're looking at about 1,000 years of writing. And this is very different than the New Testament, right? The New Testament was written in less than 100 years, maybe 50 years. So that's remarkable, that this process, this enterprise was going on for so long. To me, it's just historically, it's very impressive to me. Okay, how about the division of the books? How are they divided? The Protestant arrangement of the Old Testament is identical to the Roman Catholic arrangement of the books, though they have different numbers altogether, the Catholics have more books than the Protestants do, or the Protestants have fewer than the Roman Catholics do. The arrangement of the books is the same. That is to say, you have the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, followed by historical books. Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. And then after that, you have the books of wisdom, like Psalms being the most famous, and Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes. And then after that, you have the prophets. So that's the arrangement of the books into those sections. So here's an important and useful distinction. The Protestant Old Testament has the exact same books as the Jewish Bible, but they're simply in a different order. Right? So if you pick up your Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or maybe you're on to the BHQ, or whatever Hebrew Bible you like to use, if you simply go through the books, you'll find they're exactly the same as the ones in your ESV or your NIV or your New Living Translation. But they're simply in a different order. So if you pick up your Hebrew Bible, your Jewish Bible in Hebrew, you will find that it ends with Chronicles, which is a lot different than the Protestant Old Testament, which ends with Malachi. And in fact, if you look at the end of Malachi, it talks about God not wanting there to be a curse upon the land and sending Elijah back for the great and terrible day of the Lord. And then you turn the page and it's the Gospel according to Matthew. And so some people wonder if the Protestant arrangement of the books doesn't sort of set the stage for the New Testament. Whereas ending with Chronicles, of course, retells the story of the kings and exile and return, but it's all done from a very positive perspective, right? It's done from the Persian period where they don't mention Bathsheba and they don't mention Solomon's idolatry. And so the Chronicles ends with, everything being very positive. People are returning. Okay, anyway, that's the Protestant overview of the Old Testament. And there you can see the books, right? Pentateuch, the historical books, poetry and wisdom, followed by the prophets. Okay. Hopefully you've got those memorized. As a kid, sometimes you memorize these things. If I would recommend memorizing the books in the Bible. I assume most of you do. If you don't, what better time than now? Okay, the Old Testament Catholic Bible, a lot of this information is very much the same as the previous slide, but here we've got 46 books instead of 39. So according to math, we've got a difference of 7. So I have 7 additional books. And of course, that depends on how you count them, and I'll say more on that later. The languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, right? So, and that's the difference. The books that are in the Catholic Old Testament that are not in the Protestant Old Testament are books that were either written in Greek or they survive in Greek, right? So Maccabees, right? It's in Greek. All the manuscripts for Maccabees are in Greek. I mean, there could be some Aramaic fragments out there. I don't think so, but it's a Greek text. And so here the storyline is very much the same. It's an Israelite story that begins with creation and it goes on through into the Hellenistic period, right? So it's after the Greeks have conquered the Persians, and now you have Greek rule by the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in Palestine and Egypt, or Israel and Egypt. And same thing here. It was written in the 15th century down into the Greek period. The division is just the same as what we saw for the Protestant canon, right? Pentateuch, historical books, poetry and wisdom, and prophets. Okay, now here some distinctions here. They have 7 more books than the Protestants do, and of course these are in Greek, right? As we said before, the ones that were written in Greek or survive in Greek. For example, Ecclesiasticus, also known as Sirach, was not written in Greek, but it survives in Greek. And there is a copy of that among the Dead Sea Scrolls in Aramaic, I believe. Right, so storyline history of the Israelites from creation until the Greek Hellenistic period. Oh, okay, so we have some, sorry, had some repeats there on information. So Genesis through Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch is just the same, and then moving on here, you'll see we've got Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and then we add in Tobit and Judith, and 1 and 2 Maccabees. So we have 4 historical books that are additional, right? And if you've never read any of these books, they're enjoyable reading, but anyway, they're not in the Protestant Old Testament. Moving on to wisdom, what looks different here? We've got the Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus. So that gets up to 6 books that are additional. And then moving on here, we've got the letter of we've got Baruch plus letter of. I'm not sure what's going on there. Sorry. Moving on down, we should have. Well, and I guess that's it. There's also additions to Daniel and additions to Esther that are included among the Apocrypha. So those books are both expanded. The additions to Esther are sometimes called Esdras. But anyway, very much the same. Much different. Okay, now let me share with you a bit of biblical textual criticism. This is something that I sort of did in terms of my own research and just being a biblical academic, trying to be doing biblical scholarship. And there's value in this, I think, for the pastor, though this is often tedious and people get maybe bored, discouraged, thinking about these things. It is useful in the sense of, where does your Bible come from? Right? For me, this is sort of a first principle or a first step in my thinking. Where does the text actually come from? Right? And if you've ever, hopefully you've learned about the idea of an eclectic text, right? So your Greek New Testament and your Hebrew Old Testament that you read in English does not exist in any single manuscript. The manuscript that you're reading has been created based upon hundreds of different manuscripts being evaluated. And so they choose what they think the best reading is. And of course, ekleo is the word there for choosing. So we have an eclectic text. And so where does the Old Testament come from? And understanding the different manuscript families, I think, can be very useful, especially in a day and age when some folks are very skeptical about the Bible and where it comes from. And both the New Testament and the Old Testament, in my mind, have an excellent textual history, unlike any other ancient text, by far. It's absolutely remarkable. And so it's useful to be able to study these things. So the Masoretic text is the most famous family of manuscripts. And the Masoretic text comes out of Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism sort of becomes a thing really around the year 200, I would say, after the Second Jewish Revolt against the Romans, after the so-called Bar Kokhba or the Bar Kosiba revolt against the Romans. Judaism becomes less militant and it becomes more literary and sort of inward focused, more focused on piety. And Rabbinic Judaism ends up with this method of copying manuscripts that is remarkably exact, right? The Masoretic tradition, strictly speaking, comes really at a medieval time from around the Sea of Galilee, around like maybe the 8th century. However, there's evidence for the rabbinic, sort of what they would call a proto-Masoretic text, a text that goes all the way back to really the days of origin, around the year 200. So the Masoretic text as a tradition goes back quite far. Of course, this is Hebrew and Aramaic, these are the manuscripts that they're copying. Rabbinic Judaism was not interested in having a Greek text. The manuscripts that come out of the Masoretic tradition are for the Jewish Bible, right? They're the 39 books of the Protestant Old Testament. The positive aspects of the Masoretic text first would be it's in the original language. And so you're not separated by, a step of translation. So just like in English, you might be reading the text and you say, oh, that's exactly what the book of Isaiah uses, the same word that they did in the book of Genesis for this thing. And it's like, well, do they really? The English is the same, but in the Hebrew, is it different? Right? And so you sort of have that question that you have to go past. In the Masoretic text, it's in the original language. So there's sort of this assumption that you're looking, if there's no corruptions in the text, well, then you're looking at this continuous chain of Hebrew to Hebrew to Hebrew. So that's a plus. Another positive aspect of the Masoretic text is that it's very reliable. The deviations among the Masoretic texts are nothing like you find among the Latin manuscripts of the Old Testament. And yes, there are many Latin manuscripts of the Old Testament, and certainly not like anything you find within the Septuagint, right? There's a variety of Septuagint recensions out there. And if you get into this stuff, I mean, they have charts and maps that help you keep track of the different manuscript recensions, right? The Kaiga recension, the different hexapolaric recensions like Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, and it becomes kind of complicated and confusing. And the Hebrew simply doesn't have that. The Masoretic text is very reliable. And it's not, people used to think it was perfect, like it was the perfect translation. In fact, this is, I'm not sure the reliability of the manuscripts was a factor for Luther, but certainly not long after Luther, there were many people who thought that the Hebrew had a perfect way of copying. It was sort of reliable all the way back to Moses. And, that's not entirely true, but it is a very reliable text and it's very impressive. Okay, the bad thing for the Masoretic text is it's from a late period, right? The most famous manuscript. In fact, most of your Old Testament will be based upon this one particular manuscript. It's called the Leningrad Codex because it was found at, I believe, a monastery in Leningrad. This is before it went back to St. Petersburg. When it was under communist control, it was known as Leningrad. And that dates to around the year 1000, right? There's one that's a little bit older than that called the Aleppo Codex, which is also very famous. Some of that was destroyed in a fire. But it's late. I mean, it's AD 1000, and so that's the bad part. Your English Old Testament is mostly based upon the Masoretic text, by and large. I have a copy of the Leningrad Codex here, and I mean, you could do your own study of this and just, get out your Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or better yet, you could get out the eclectic text that's being produced out of England by Ron Hendel and sort of see what they do and how that compares to the Leningrad Codex, and you'll find that they are almost always the same. Okay, and there's just an image of the Leningrad Codex. And I'm not sure if my pointer will show up on the video here, but you see they have little marks on the side. They call this, well, all of this, the notations that go around the text, they call them Masorah. And of course, Masar in Hebrew means to hand on. So the Masorah is the tradition, right? Tradito in Latin refers to something that's handed on, trado, like trade, right? To hand over. And so this is the tradition that's been handed on from one generation to the next. And what they would do is they would record if there's a strange form within the text. Because remember, the Hebrew text was being written over a period of 1,000 years. And think of how English has changed in 1,000 years. I mean, get out your, not that you have one, but I've got a copy of, some facsimile of the King James from 1611. And let me tell you, they spelled English different than we do today. Himself will be spelled Hymselfe. Now, if you're copying that and you believe that it's Holy Scripture inspired by God, as these scribes did, what do you do with weird forms like that? Do you correct it? Do you update the language? Because the language changes over the course of 1,000 years. And so what they would do in the Masoretic text is if it were a strange form, they would make a note of it. And then they would count how many times that strange word appears within Scripture. And then they would put that number on the side to let you know that, yes, this is a strange form. However, it appears elsewhere, and you should leave it alone and copy it just as it is. And it's for this reason that the word for scribe in Hebrew is sofer, and safar in Hebrew means to count, right? Because these scribes were often counting, and they became known as counters. And the Mizora, there's the so-called Mizora Magna and the Mizora Parwa, or the large Mizora and the small Mizora. But and also they included notes for They came up with a system for dotting vowels, right? And Semitic languages at the outset had no vowels. The Greeks invented vowels, right? But if you look at, say, Moabite or Akkadian or Ugaritic or any of the ancient Semitic languages, you won't find vowels, you'll just find consonants. The vowels were indicated later by what they call pointing, or dots that they would put around the text. And so you could distinguish between words that had similar consonants but different vowels. And that was, again, the exactness of the Masoretic text. And not only that, they would include what they call cantillation marks, which some people view as sort of singing notation, right? Should the syllable be up? Should the tone be up? Should the tone be down? When should you pause? When is the phrase completed? They have all sorts of additional dots that would go around the text. And this again was to assure the exact copying. And so it's really, really impressive. I mean, the Masoretes were just, you got to tip your hat to them. They were something else. Okay, so there you go. There's an image of the Aleppo Codex. The Septuagint, Septuaginta in Latin is a word for 70. And that's why it's indicated by LXX, because of course L in the Roman numeral system is 50 and X is 10, so it's up to 70. The Septuagint is an ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament that sort of began in the mid-3rd century in Alexandria, and then it continued on from there, right? They probably began with the Pentateuch and continued to translate books after that. And as the story goes, and there's a text called the Letter of Aristeas, where you can read about this tradition. Alexandria, with its famous library, sought to collect all of the writings of the known world, and there's ancient testimony of this, descriptions of people in port scouring ships looking for any manuscripts where they would take the original and create a copy for the people on the ship, and then they would put the original in their library, and they just sought to acquire all texts, which, that's sort of very scientific. They want to acquire all knowledge, right? Science, scientias, means knowledge. And so that was the plan. And so as the story goes in the Letter of Aristeas, they sent word to Jerusalem that they wanted a copy of the great Jewish law. And so Jerusalem sent down 6 translators, 6 translators for each of the 12 tribes. So that's 72 translators for the 12 tribes. And they created this translation. And so it becomes known as the translation of the 72. And I'm not sure what happened to the 2 and why it's now known as just the 70. It might have to do with the Letter of Aristeas probably being more folklore or legend than it is, historical truth, or to use the phrase others like. It's counterfactual. It's saying things that aren't that did not occur historically. 70, I should also mention, is within Judaism, 70 becomes a way of referring to the nations, so the world at large. So there are sort of 70 nations, and within Jewish folklore, Jewish midrash, we have this idea that God sort of shopped the Torah around to the 70 different nations, right? And so 70 becomes a way of saying the rest of the world. And so the Septuagint has the sense of being a translation for the secular world. It's not the Hebrew. It's in, the lingua franca of the day, the secular language of the day, Greek. I should also mention, by the time you get to Augustine, who lived in the early 5th century, you have a story of 70 translators going into 70 separate booths, and they all came out with the exact same translation. And isn't it just a miracle? So the Septuagint becomes known as this sacred translation itself. And in fact, Augustine gives grief to St. Jerome, the church father Jerome, who gives us the Vulgate, telling him that, Jerome, you are not smarter than those great translators. If they missed anything, you're not going to catch it. So why are you translating from Hebrew into Latin? We have Latin manuscripts already, translated from the Greek. And Jerome replies, well, then why are you writing commentaries on Hebrew books if it's such a perfect translation? Okay, well, anyway, ancient Greek translation from the 3rd century BC. The apocryphal books come from the Septuagint, right? These are the extra, as Protestants view it, these are the extra books that are in the Roman Catholic canon. I should say also, apocrypha, that's a term, if you look it up in Latin, it's not a complementary term. And for this reason, some people prefer to say deuterocanonical, although apocrypha is the term has been used for hundreds of years, right? The Catholics, this is the term that they use. In fact, the term apocrypha comes from Jerome himself, who translated the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament, into Latin, right? And this is the Vulgate, right? And vulgar meaning common. And so the Vulgate is the common translation, the translation of the people. And in after the Protestant Reformation and the Council of Trent, you have the Vulgate becoming known as the official translation of the Catholic Church. Jerome, who produced the Vulgate, didn't like the apocryphal books. So he translates Tobit and he translates Maccabees and Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus. He translates these things, but he doesn't view them as being inspired. And so his views are actually very similar to Martin Luther, where he thought these books are good and useful for the church, but they are not inspired. And so that term apocrypha means questionable, and it comes from Jerome himself. Okay, but we're in the 3rd century BC here, which is, hundreds of years before Jerome. This is the first Bible of the Christian Church, and that's important to emphasize. If you have a USB, Greek New Testament, you'll find in the back they both have charts in the back of them, the Nestle Aland and the USB. Sorry, the USB. No, that's your computer. The UBS, United Bible Society. If you look in the back, they have charts where they will look at quotations from the Old Testament, and then they will also indicate if these are taken from the Greek Septuagint, or if they're, paraphrased or taken not from the Septuagint. I'm not sure exactly what's otherwise indicated there, but you can see that the New Testament, when it quotes from the Old Testament, regularly quotes from the Greek Septuagint. And of course, this makes sense, right? None of you in your church probably read publicly from the Hebrew Old Testament, right? If you did, most people wouldn't understand what you were reading. So same thing in the early church. They would use a Greek Old Testament. And you see this in titles, right? So the first book of the Bible is called Genesis. Genesis is not a Hebrew title, right? The first book of the Bible in the Hebrew Old Testament is Bereshith, or Bereshit, if you use the modern Hebrew pronunciations. The second book is called Shemot, whereas in our English Bibles, we call them Genesis, which is a Greek word for, birth, or you have birth or beginning. And for the second book, we have Exodus, as in exodos, the road out, right? These both. So in English, we use the Greek titles for these books because of the Septuagint. So it's the first Bible of the church. The good part about the Septuagint is, though the manuscripts come later, for example, if you study New Testament textual criticism, you'll know that Codex Sinaiticus is one of these great manuscripts that goes from Genesis to Revelation. And in fact, that one might even include some New Testament Apocrypha. I forget. But it's this massive, massive tome, this super huge book, codex. And the text for that comes from like the 5th century. I forget exactly, but I believe it's the 5th or 4th century. So that Septuagint manuscript, which is very, very important, comes from that time period. Or, Alexandrinus or Vaticanus. These all come from, around the time of Constantine or a little bit later. But because it's a translation, you sort of get a snapshot or a good guess of what the before Christ text would have looked like. And so you can guess what the text might have looked like, 200 years before Christ, which is pretty good because the Masoretic text comes from 1,000 years after Christ. So the Septuagint's very useful in that sense. It can also often give us a snapshot of a very old Hebrew text. The bad part about the Septuagint is that it's a translation, and this separates us from the original language by a step. And Jerome talks about this, and Luther too. Jerome loved the Hebrew because it removed that step. He called it the Hebraica Veritas, or the Hebrew truth, where he could get back to the original. So anyway, that's a downside of the Septuagint. Okay. And there's a picture of Codex Sinaiticus, and this is one of the great uncial texts, as they say, U-N-C-I-A-L, uncial. And for us English speakers, we often say it's written in all capital letters, and it's not written. There's no sort of lowercase or the lower script that you see used. And notice there's no real punctuation. There's no spaces. Where they would break the line, they might determine, right? They might break that off at the end of the word, or they might determine a syllable with that. But this is how they wrote. And if you can find higher resolution images of it, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Masoretic text that we talked about before, Leningrad and Aleppo, they're absolutely beautiful. So anyway, that's that. One more thing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, you have Hebrew texts from a pre-Christian era, which is just remarkable, right? So like the Isaiah scroll, right? They've got a copy of Isaiah that may go back to the time of the Maccabees, right? So it's almost a couple hundred years before Christ. And when you think of manuscripts as a game of telephone, a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy kind of a thing, and how far back does that game of telephone go? When did Isaiah live, right? So Isaiah Isaiah lived, he's an 8th century prophet, right? Or Jeremiah, even better yet, Jeremiah saw the destruction of Jerusalem, right? So he lived right around the beginning of the 6th century. And so if our oldest Hebrew copy of that comes from AD 1000, and then they find the Dead Sea Scrolls and they have a Hebrew text from 100 BC, you're cutting off over 1,000 years of that telephone game. And so it's really remarkable. And then one way of sort of strengthening your view of the biblical text in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the alignment between the agreement between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls is remarkable, right? It's they're very much the same, and sure, you can find differences, but none of them are glaring or substantial. And so this shows that they had a way of copying the Bible that was very reliable. And so we don't have any of the originals, but it was copied early, it was copied often, and, you know, in my opinion, all signs point to reliable. So, anywho, the Dead Sea Scrolls, another important family of texts. Okay, and in terms of how we get these texts, how they make their way to us, the first Jewish revolt, which comes after, you know, the days of Jesus, AD 70, plays an important role. So the Essenes, and you may or may not know this, they dreamed of going to war against the Romans. You know, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a text called the War Scroll, where they thought someday the sons of light will battle the sons of darkness and establish a new kingdom. And the sons of light were the Essenes and God's angels, and the sons of darkness was the Romans and the devils. And someday there would be a war, and they would defeat the Romans, or the Kittim, as they called them, and they would establish their new rule. And so when the war broke out, it would make sense to me that all of these Essenes would have hidden away their precious manuscripts in caves, and then they grabbed their weapons and they went to war, and they were all killed or chased away, and no one ever came back to those scrolls until they were discovered by a couple of Bedouin boys in the 1940s. And so nobody preserves the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Caves preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls. Rabbinic Judaism gives to us the Masoretic text, right? And I say Pharisaic / rabbinic. The Pharisees, of course, Rabbinic Judaism grows out of Pharisaic Judaism, but they are different. And so they give us the Masoretic text, and Christianity gives us the Septuagint, right? Though at one point there was a Greek-speaking Jewish presence in Alexandria that was very prominent, right? So Philo of Alexandria comes to mind, right? The father of biblical allegory. Eventually, the Greek-speaking biblical folks in Egypt become Christian. And so the Septuagint is really preserved within Christianity. And that's where your Bible comes from. All right, and I think that's probably